Okay, so here's a fossil skull that is not quite human, but we can tell it's really close. If you look at it, at first glance, it looks like a human skull, and at second glance, you start to see that the face sticks out a little bit more than a modern human. So this is a skull that was found, I think, in South Africa, and it was along the way to modern humanity. So we're calling this the road to humanity. And we could think of this as a big journey from the seas to the trees, from the grasslands to the cities, and maybe on to the stars. So, first of all, a couple of vocabulary terms: phylogeny and taxonomy. Phylogeny is when we study the family tree of organisms like this. So these are the true bacteria, and their family tree splits apart like in all these different directions. Here's the what we call the archaea, the ancient bacteria, and their family tree is like this. And then all other living things, this is mostly what we think of, the eukaryotes are over here. So here's our family tree. In fact, here's us. We're this little branch of the animals coming off of here. Here's the plants. Here's the fungi. So we're more closely related to these guys than we are to these guys. So we're looking at relationships over time and evolutionary change and what's happened to our DNA as well. The other term, taxonomy, is when we classify organisms into different groups. And these are the terms that we use in taxonomy. The biggest term is a domain. And so these are the three domains of organisms: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryota, the eukaryotes, the ancient bacteria, and the true bacteria. Then we take these domains and we divide them into smaller groups called kingdoms, like the animal kingdom, the fungus kingdom, the plant kingdom. Then we divide those kingdoms into phyla, and we divide those into classes, and we divide those into orders, and so on until we get to a species. And so that's what we're going to do with our road to humanity today. We're going to start by looking at, I think we start with our kingdom. Let's see. But then we'll narrow it down from the kingdom to our phylum. We're not going to look at the other phylum, just the one that we belong to. Then we'll look at our class and our order. So we're going to narrow this more and more down, little by little, until finally we end up with just at the very bottom, we end up with Homo sapiens, which is modern humanity. So here we go. We start with the animal kingdom. What makes a creature an animal? Well, there are four things that define an animal. They have to be made of multiple cells. They have to have complex cells. They're eukaryotic creatures. They are eukaryotes. They are heterotrophic. Maybe you remember that means they eat. They are consumers. They do not conduct photosynthesis. That would be autotrophic. And the fourth thing that makes it an animal is that they are able to move. They are mobile. So at least at some point in their life cycle, they can move. So some animals are immobile as adults, but as a larva, they swim around. So that's what we mean at some point in their life cycle. Like coral larvae swim around until they find a place where they can attach themselves, and then they are there for the rest of their life. They're stationary at that point. Fungi do not do this. So fungi are not in the animal kingdom. Plants do not do the heterotrophic one. So that's why they're not in our kingdom either. But both fungi and plants are multicellular and eukaryotic. So that's why we're kind of similar to them in a way. So all of these things are in the animal kingdom. And there's all kinds of sound effects here that I'm going to try to turn down, I think. All of these are animals. Here's coral down in the bottom left. Here's a bee. Doesn't it fly around? Doesn't it eat food? It is an animal. These guys, like I said, swim when they're larvae, but then they're stationary. But they eat food. They are animals. They're made of many complex cells. All of these guys are part of the animal kingdom. And then, of course, there are many extinct animals as well. Okay. So within the animal kingdom, if we look at this, we're not very much like coral. We're not very much like turtles. We don't have feathers. We're not dinosaurs. We're certainly not like a snail or a fish. We don't have wings, but wait a minute. We do have hair. We do have a backbone. We do have warm blood like this. So we're most closely related to the lion in this whole list. But with the animal kingdom, before we get to the lions and the other mammals, we're going to separate the ones with backbones, turtles, eagles, lions, fish, dinosaurs. All these guys with backbones are more closely related to us than these invertebrates like the coral, the snail, and the bee. We're all animals, but we're going to split off from the invertebrates at this point. So we call this group that's basically all the vertebrates, we are called chordates. And there are three things that make us a chordate. First, all chordates have what's called a notochord. And this is along the back, it's dorsal. And it is protective connective tissue. In us, it turns into the spine. As we develop from an embryo, it starts off more like cartilage, but then it turns into bone as we mature before birth. The second thing that all chordates have in common is we have a nerve cord also along our back. It's basically protected by this notochord. So in us, it becomes our spinal cord and our brain, and it's found on our back. This is different than like in an insect. They have a nerve cord, but it's along their belly. It's not on their back. It's not dorsal. The third thing all chordates have, believe it or not, is gill slits at some point in their life cycle. So when we were embryos, we actually had gills start to form. And the first stage is that these slits open up in our throat. These openings in our throat widen, but since we're not fish, they then closed up again. But we inherited this same pattern of development from the fish ancestors that we share. All of these things are chordates. All of these, except for maybe one, we'll see, are vertebrates. So we have cartilage fish. Instead of a full bony skeleton, they have a skeleton made of cartilage. This includes all the rays, also the sharks. Then we have all the rest of the fish. These are known as the bony fish. This would include salmon and tuna, trout, and then like this angelfish. Most fish in the world are bony fish. Then we have the amphibians, frogs and the newts and the salamanders and the toads. All these guys have really thin skin, and they can live on land as adults, but they're still stuck to the water, showing that they're pretty closely related to fish. They're still stuck to the water for laying their eggs. So they start life in the water, and then as they mature, they can come out on land. They start out as an egg, then they become a tadpole, then they go through metamorphosis and they become a frog. But then we got some reptiles. These guys now have a thicker skin and they can lay eggs on land. Their eggs have a shell that's basically leathery, and they are now released from the water. They can live in the desert at this point. And this would include all the snakes, all the lizards, the crocodiles, and the turtles are all in the reptile group. Snakes do have a spine. Even if they don't have legs, they still have a spine, they have ribs, they have a skull. Then we got the birds. So here we have some reptiles evolved feathers. Their scales became feathers. And you can even see, if you look closely at a bird, you can see that it still has scales on its legs and sometimes on their face. If they have bare skin, you can see that it's scaly. So they have that in common with the reptiles. These guys also lay eggs, but these eggs now have the hard shell of what we think of as an egg. And then the last group of chordates are the mammals. These guys have fur, they're warm-blooded, and they have live young. They never lay an egg. They keep the egg inside of their womb where it develops into an embryo and a fetus, and then we give birth to live young instead of laying an egg. So that makes us a chordate. And if we look way back in time, we find some creatures that were in between the vertebrates and the invertebrates. They were missing links. And there's some of these that are still alive today, specifically a creature called a sea squirt, properly called a tunicate. So this is showing some of the body parts of a tunicate larva, and we share many of these same body parts. First, here's its notochord, this pink part. In us, this would then develop into the spine, and it would wrap around the dorsal nerve cord. This would be the spinal cord of this creature with its brain up here. So our notochord, our spine, wraps around our spinal cord to protect it. Down here we have the gill slits of this creature where it's absorbing oxygen from the water. We also have a heart, and we have a mouth over here, and the stomach over here, and then the anus over there. So this creature is called a sea squirt because it takes in water and then squirts it back out again. And the water comes in and they filter out any food particles, they pick up oxygen, and then the wastes go out the other side. So this is kind of like our great, 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 great ancestor before the vertebrates evolved. Okay, well, in the mammals, we have certain characteristics. All mammals are warm-blooded, like us. They all have live young, except for two very primitive mammals, the platypus and the echidna. These guys still lay eggs, but they have hair, and they give their babies milk. Those are the other characteristics of being a mammal. So all of these creatures here are mammals, just like we are. Now, when I say they're warm-blooded, what that means is their body temperature always stays the same. For humans, it's 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 37 degrees Celsius. And these guys maintain that body temperature regardless of the temperature outside. In a way, warm-blooded is not a very good name for this. Because, for example, a lizard in the desert might have its body temperature 105 degrees during the day. But at night, the lizard's body temperature might drop down to 75 degrees. So the temperature of the lizard changes throughout the day. We call it cold-blooded, but it's not that it's cold. It's really that its temperature changes. Its temperature is whatever the outside is. The better name for that is ectothermic. And the better name for us, where we keep the constant temperature, is homeothermic. We maintain that constant temperature. So all of these are more closely related to us than any of the other pictures we've looked at so far, because these guys all share these same characteristics. Some of them don't have very much hair, like the elephant or the dolphin, or humans for that matter, but they do have hair, and they're warm-blooded, live young, and they feed them milk. Now, which of these are we the most closely related to? Wouldn't you agree that it's the monkey is the most like a human out of all these guys? I mean, they have hands. Nobody else has hands, do they? So that right there says that we are a primate. And this is the order that we belong to. So what makes a primate a primate? Well, first of all, they have an opposable thumb. And in this case, oppose means it can go against their fingers. Like you can touch all of your fingers with your thumb. That's what it means to have an opposable thumb. All primates have this ability. Really, no other animals can do that. Think about the thumb of a dog. it's halfway up its leg. We call it the dew claw. That's the remnant of the dog's thumb, is way up on its forearm. Um, and it certainly can't touch its other fingers with that, and that means it can't grip objects the way primates can. Next, all primates have binocular vision, and it's in color. So binocular vision means we're looking at the same object with both eyes simultaneously. It doesn't mean we can zoom in on it, but it means we can see the same thing with both eyes. Now, think about the way a horse's face is shaped. One eye looks to the left and the other eye looks to the right. That is not binocular. They're seeing different things with both eyes. It's a really good thing to have if you are a prey animal. So we see many prey animals lack binocular vision. But for predators or for animals that have to jump through the trees, their eyes are often facing forward so they can judge the distance to the branch that they're jumping to. If they misjudge that distance, they could fall to the bottom of the tree and die along the way. So binocular vision is really important. It helps us judge distance accurately. Color vision, we think, came about because we were eating fruit, and it helps us tell when it's ripe by looking for that color change. Not all animals see in color, and we know this because we can analyze the cells that are found in their eyes. For instance, dogs cannot see in color. Next, all primates, for their size, have a pretty large brain, and their behavior is quite complex. So we have amongst the largest of brains, at least for our body size. Now, obviously, an elephant, being so big, has a bigger brain than we do, but compared to its body size, it's not as big as ours. Whales and dolphins, their brains, in comparison to their body size, are about as big as ours. So we think they might be very intelligent. Next, all primates, so this is true not only of humans, but also of all monkeys and all apes, we all have nails instead of claws. That's unique to the primates. So I don't know if you knew that monkeys don't have claws, they have nails just like you and me. Another thing about primates is we usually have only a couple offspring at a time, but what we do is we take care of them really well. So some organisms have they lay lots of eggs, and then they don't take care of them at all. And if they survive, good. If they don't, oh well, sorry. But we don't take that approach. Instead, we take good care of our offspring, and they're dependent on parents for a long time, and they need to learn lots of things in order to survive. That's the approach that all primates have to reproduction. Another thing about primates compared to other animals is their face is pretty flat. So we don't have a snout like a dog or a lion. So all of these guys are primates. Here's a monkey from Africa, I think. And here's a chimpanzee. A South American monkey. And I can tell you that it's South American because it's using its tail like an extra hand. And then this guy is not a monkey, it's not an ape, it's what we call a primitive primate, a prosimian. It has all of these characteristics that we listed, but its brain isn't that big and its behavior isn't that complex, and it's relatively small. And I tell you, the one reason that I know that I'm a primate and related mostly to the chimp is because look at this guy drumming. That tells me that I've got something in common with him or her. So let's look at all these primates. First, we have the primitive primates, the prosimians. They have all the primate characteristics, but they're not very developed. Their brains are not as big. Their muzzle, in other words, their snout, tends to be bigger. Their thumb might not be completely opposable like ours. Sometimes their index finger and their thumb work together instead of opposing each other. Many of these species are nocturnal and they have really big eyes because of that. It takes up space in their skull to have such big eyes, and that's one reason their brains would be smaller. And some examples, you've heard of the lemurs of Madagascar. Other examples include the tarsier, the bush baby, and the loris. So lemurs are found only on the island of Madagascar, which by plate tectonics broke off from Africa long ago, before monkeys evolved. So after the lemurs evolved, after prosimians evolved on Africa, that's when the island of Madagascar broke off. And when Madagascar broke off, there were some lemurs on it. Also, some lemurs on mainland Africa. But then the lemurs on mainland Africa evolved into monkeys. But evolution took a different path on the island of Madagascar, and the lemurs survived there. On Africa, the monkeys kind of took over. So here's a picture of the well-known ring-tailed lemur. This is a primate. It's like a monkey, but more primitive. It has a thumb that it uses to pick things up. Tarsier from the Philippines. And can you tell that this guy's nocturnal by the size of its eyes? The other thing I think is really cool on this guy is its thumbs. Look at, well, its whole hands. Doesn't that look like your hand in a lot of ways, with the fingers and the thumb coming off of there? I think that guy must be related to us. All right. Now, monkeys. We divide the monkeys into two groups, the Old World and the New World monkeys. So Old World means that they live in Africa and Asia. It would also include Europe, but there are no monkeys there except for Gibraltar. They have a tail, but they cannot pick things up with their tail, and the proper term for that is a prehensile tail. If they're able to pick things up and use their tail like a fifth hand, we say it's a prehensile tail. This did not evolve in Africa. Then their brain is more advanced than the New World monkeys. They tend to be bigger. And this is an interesting one, as we'll see. The nostrils open downward. Just like you and me, our nostrils open facing downward, but that's different than the New World monkeys. Their thumb is strongly opposable, like us. And examples include baboons, rhesus monkeys, and macaques. On the other hand, after Africa split apart from South America, those monkeys evolved in a different direction. So just like Madagascar split off from Africa and took some lemurs with it, but on Africa they evolved in one way and Madagascar they evolved in a different way. Later, South America split off from Africa, and the monkeys that had evolved in Africa evolved in different directions after the split. So in South America, they evolved the prehensile tail that they can use to hang from limbs, that they can use to pick up objects. Their brain is simpler, though, and their body is smaller. And this seems crazy to me, but their nostrils open to the sides of their nose. Just imagine what it's like when they sneeze. A little different than what happens for us. Their thumb is less opposable than the African monkeys. And examples include the spider monkey, the howler monkey, the capuchin monkey. So when I say they're in South America, this should also say Central America. They're in both South and Central America. So here's a baboon and a baby. In many of these creatures, the babies look a little more human than the adults. We don't have a big long snout like this, but the baby's snout is not as obvious at this point, is it? Hanuman langur. Once again, to me, the baby just looks like a little person. This is a monkey in India. So both of these are old world monkeys so far. This one's in India. They cannot hang from their tail or pick things up. Here's a crazy looking one. The black-crested macaque. And here we have a male, a female, and a baby. Now we're moving to South America and Central America, where we find spider monkeys that have that prehensile tail. I remember seeing a troop of these when I was visiting Brazil. We were walking through the forest on this trail, and we heard this commotion in the trees above us. And all these spider monkeys, maybe a dozen of them, came jumping from branch to branch until they were right over us. And they're making all this noise. I think they were trying to scare us from their territory. And then they started breaking branches and dropping them. And then they started throwing their own feces at us. Yeah, that was the ultimate insult. Here's another baby South American monkey, the woolly monkey, really thick fur. And now we move on to the apes. So the apes are only found in Africa and Asia. If you noticed, when I was describing characteristics of New World and Old World monkeys, it seemed like we shared more things with the Old World monkeys than the New World monkeys. So we probably evolved from them with apes along the way. And this kind of fits because Africa and Asia, the old world, are the only places that have apes. So the New World monkeys are not as closely related to us as the old world monkeys. One way you can always recognize an ape as different from a monkey is that it does not have a tail. Monkeys always have tails. Sometimes they can use them as a fifth hand, sometimes they can't, but apes never have tails. Their brain is bigger and their body is bigger. And generally, their body has been modified to stand up occasionally. And so these different alterations in their body shape, a shorter back, barrel chested, meaning they're more round in the chest like we are. You know how our chest is from shoulder to shoulder, whereas a dog does not have a barrel chest. That's more like a New World monkey. And let's see, the apes got a stronger pelvis and their arms are longer than their legs. Like us and like the old world monkeys, apes' nostrils open downward. Their wrist is more mobile, their thumb is more accurate than in monkeys. Again, they're becoming more and more like us. Now, there are only 6 types of apes: the siamang, the gibbon, the orangutan, the gorilla, the chimpanzee, and the bonobo. Bonobo is sometimes called pygmy chimp. They look a lot like chimpanzees, but their behavior is very different, so we've decided they're a separate species. On the other hand, there's 50 or 100 different species of monkeys. So the apes, only a few different kinds. Monkeys, in a way, are more successful because there's so many of them. Many of the apes are endangered as well. Now here's a gibbon, which at first glance might look like a monkey, but if you look closely, it has no tail. You can also see it has thumbs that can grip things on its feet. It has an opposable big toe as well as opposable thumbs. These guys generally move from branch to branch by swinging from their arms like this guy is. It's an orangutan. Big ape from only 2 places in the world have orangutans left, the islands of Borneo and Sumatra. Highly endangered species. This one is a big male, and I can tell because the males develop these big pads of fat on the sides of their face. I guess that's what the females like. Then we have a gorilla. Here's a whole family of gorillas. One gorilla, the dominant male, is sometimes called a silverback. He's still the same species, but this is the dominant mature male. As the males get older, they develop that silver coloration on their back. You can see this is their normal stance. They normally stand on 4 legs, but he's standing on his knuckles, so we call this knuckle walking. This is true for all the apes. They do not tend to stand up on their hind legs. They can for a minute, but their most comfortable way of walking around is on all 4s, with their fingers curled into a fist, and they're standing on their knuckles. And here's a chimpanzee. We think this is our closest living relative. These guys are very intelligent. In fact, this is a photo of this chimp using a tool. So they took this stick and broke it into the right shape where they can take the stick and put it into this termite mound down here. Then the termites crawl all over the stick, and the monkey pulls out the termite covered stick, and it has a whole termite sickle. I don't think they have figured out how to freeze them into a popsicle yet, but it's definitely using a tool. In this case, we call it termite fishing. Not very many animals use tools. Chimpanzees are one of the smart ones that do. So if we look at the evolution of primates, 65 million years ago is when the dinosaurs went extinct, and the earliest true primates, the earliest, oldest fossils we find that have these primate characteristics, 54 million years old. Then we had this split back here between the very simple primates and the monkeys and apes. So here's our lemur and tarsier and stuff like that. Simple primates over here, split apart, what, around 45 million years ago? We've been separate from them and evolving in our own direction for that long. Then the monkeys and apes, they started to split into different groups. First, the New World monkeys split off. So they're the most different. Then the Old World monkeys split off. And back here, around what, 25 million years ago, the human path split off from the apes. So we call this kind of a family tree. This would be showing the phylogeny of the primates. All right, so let's zoom in on our group, which are called the hominids. So the hominids evolved from the apes, and you can think of a hominid as an ape man or an ape woman. They are fully bipedal. In other words, 2 foot. They walk on 2 legs all the time. The ape is a quadruped. It walks on 4 legs most of the time. But hominids, fully bipedal. And this requires not only just deciding to stand up, but we have to change our bodies. We have to have hips that are short and wide. We have to have long legs. Our toes have to give up being able to grasp objects. And our head has to be straight above our spine instead of having the spine coming out of it at an angle from the back, which is the way the apes are. So going back to these body changes, that means when we find a skeleton of a fossil, we can tell from its hips that it was walking on 2 legs, or we can tell from its toes, or from the location of where the spine fit on the head. That can tell us if it was actually walking on 2 legs or not. Their thumb is fully opposable, and we find evidence of them using tools. Their brain is even bigger, and their face is even smaller than the apes. Now, there are some parts of the skull which we see change from apes to humans, and it kind of goes through a range of sizes in different hominids. The brow ridge is this ridge of bone where the eyebrows are, and it kind of sticks out above the ape's eyes. The muzzle, again, is like the snout, the mouth and the nose. They tend to get a flatter face and lose that muzzle. The sagittal crest, I want you to imagine a mohawk, but made of bone. That's what a gorilla has. It has this crest of bone where a mohawk would be. Of course, it's underneath its skin. Um, and that crest allows its very powerful jaw muscles to attach to it. So they lose these features, but they gain their cranium. That's their brain case. That's how we can tell that their brain was bigger, and their forehead tends to get bigger. The jaw also changes in hominids. It becomes more in the shape of a U, whereas in an ape, it's more shaped like a rectangle. Our canine teeth got smaller and smaller. We lost body hair and we developed sweat glands. And the hominids include all the species of Australopithecus and Homo. We are in this group, but we're going to take a look at our close relatives, the Australopithecines, which means southern ape. So here's Australopithecus. They're a transitional species or a missing link between apes and humans. They are ape people. It fits the definition of missing link, except that it's not missing. They looked like a bipedal ape. So I want you to imagine a chimpanzee walking around on two legs, but being comfortable doing it all the time. So we had to change its body a little bit to make that happen, but it still had a relatively small skull, still was probably quite hairy. Its head basically was like an ape, but its body was like a human. And I think this is really interesting because scientists that were first looking for the missing link, when Darwin predicted that our ancestors were the apes and people were looking for the link between us and apes, they looked for fossils expecting to find a smart ape. They thought it would have an ape body with a big brain, but that's not what they found. Instead, they found an ape that stood up with a small brain. So instead of saying, oh, we were wrong, or instead of trying to hide their discovery, they just said, you know what, this fits, the data is what it is. This fits the theory just as well. So we stood up first and we got smart later. We think they use tools, but we don't know for sure. And we only find these fossils in Africa. We find several different kinds, and they were living in Africa between 4 million and 1 million years ago when they went extinct. The most famous Australopithecus has been named Lucy because she was a pretty complete specimen, 4 million year old skeleton here with this many bones remaining. So Lucy was of the species Afarensis because she was found near a place in Ethiopia called Afar. 3 million years old. Discovered in 1974. And she was named Lucy because when they found her, they knew it was a great find, because this is actually a lot of bones to find from a single animal that's 3 million years old. And so when they were celebrating that night, it was shortly after the Beatles released Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. So they were listening to that song a lot, and they named this fossil after her. You can see we found her jaw and many pieces of her skull. We found a lot of her spine. We found one side of her hip, but enough to tell us what it was like. We found this femur. We found the other part of her knee over here. The knee and the hip in particular tells us that she was walking on two legs, although the jaw is kind of more like an ape than a human. So she was in between, little ape characteristics, little human characteristics, a transitional species. Here's another Australopithecus, and that's the picture we started with. Different species now, Australopithecus africanus, discovered in South Africa in 1924. And we have since then found other Australopithecine species. There's even more than on this list. All of these have been found in different parts of Africa, which is why I say all humans are African. So here's the skull of the Taung child. I want to point out that we see two different colors in the bone here. And that's because this front part was what they actually found in the ground. And the back part they reconstructed based on what they knew about the anatomy of skulls. So we think that hominids, our ape-like ancestors, went through a cycle that fed on itself. So we call it a feedback cycle, which allowed them to evolve. We have these different behaviors that improved survival if they kept growing on each other. So to begin with, the ice ages up here at the top, the ice ages would have caused the forests in Africa to shrink and the grasslands to expand. So it would have been helpful to stand up since you're not in the trees and you need to see over these 4 and 6 foot tall grasses. Group cooperation and bipedalism, standing up, would aid their survival on these open grasslands. They probably shared food at a home base, and that would increase their social ties with one another. We're a very social species. And then we would start making tools and using tools. And that would promote both keeping our hands free. So it would promote standing on two legs, bipedalism. It would also promote brain development as we were improving our hand-eye coordination. As our brains got more complex, we would have better communication and extended learning. And that would carry on through this long time of infant care and childhood development, which would improve cooperation and survival. And all of these really should have arrows pointing to each other, showing the feedbacks. Sharing food would help the infant survive. Communicating would help the hunting. This kind of hunting would also be assisted by the tool making. So all of these things would act upon one another to increase the cycle where our brains were getting bigger and bigger and our hands were getting more and more accurate. All right, let's move on to our own genus, the Homo genus. And there are 3 main species that we found in the Homo genus: Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and us, Homo sapiens. And you can see they lived at different times. Remember, MYA stands for a million years ago. All of these guys gradually, step by step, developed even bigger brains. Homo habilis had a bigger brain than Australopithecus, but Homo erectus was a bigger brain than habilis, and we have a bigger brain even than erectus. Same thing with our faces. They got flatter and flatter, and we assume that we lost more and more hair. Kind of hard for hair to fossilize, so that one's hard to prove, but it's probable. We found many kinds of tools associated with their fossils of these guys. Here's Homo erectus. This is a very complete skeleton found in Kenya. Once again, we're all African. 1984 is when this was found. We think that he was a boy, less than 13 years old when he died over 1.5 million years ago. We can tell he's a boy partly from his pelvis, partly from his jaw. And we can tell his age largely from his teeth, how worn they are or not. All right, Homo sapiens, that's us. Well, we actually are going to divide our own species into 2 smaller groups that we call subspecies: Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals, and then modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens. Notice we've only been around for 50,000 years. Out of all those million years that have gone by, we've only been around less than 500,000 years. Neanderthals were stockier, so they were not as tall, but they tended to be bigger boned. They actually had larger brains than us, but the brains were arranged differently. On the other hand, Cro-Magnon skeletons, you might have heard of Cro-Magnon man, a fossil discovered in France. Neanderthals discovered in Germany in the Neander Valley. The Neander River flows through this valley. In German, a valley is a Tal. So Neanderthals in Germany, Cro-Magnons found in France, and these skeletons were identical to ours. Since that time, we've found Neanderthals all across Europe and down into the Middle East. And Cro-Magnons we've found all across Europe and stretching into Asia and really around the world, because we're basically the same as Cro-Magnons. So what happened to the Neanderthals? Why did they disappear? Well, maybe we killed them. Maybe we had battles and we won, even though they were probably stronger, even though they had larger brains. Maybe our brains were arranged in a way that allowed us to make plans more effectively. So maybe that happened. On the other hand, maybe we didn't battle, but maybe we were just better at competing for food and shelter. And since we were so successful, we basically just took up all the habitat and they weren't able to survive anymore. On the other hand, maybe we interbred with them and our species merged back together. So they would have split at one point and then perhaps they came back together. And in fact, there is some DNA evidence that suggests modern humans carry as much as 5% to 10% of Neanderthal DNA. And there's some Homo sapiens. Here's a timeline of the evolution of the hominids going back to Australopithecus. So basically, if it's a dark bar, it's showing the time period that it lived. Where the bar stops is where it went extinct. Where the bar starts is where it first evolved. And then you can see sometimes we're not sure when it first evolved. But here's these different species of Australopithecus living at these different time periods. Here's the different species of Homo living at these different time periods. And there's us. And you can tell from the shape of the skull that the Neanderthal brain was shaped differently than ours. We have more brain in the forehead. They have more brain in the back. It turns out the front of our brain is largely about planning and decision making. So perhaps our ability to do that was one of the reasons we survived and they didn't. Here's some of the skulls that we found from them. Older on the left, younger on the right, with Homo across the top row and Australopithecus across the bottom row. And you can see these guys all look pretty human. These guys look much more ape-like. Some of them have reconstructed parts in the skull. There we are. All right, so here's all the hominids coming across. First, Australopithecus carrying some stone tools. And there's like the shadow of a human to show how tall we were compared to how tall they were. Then we've got, I believe this is Homo habilis. Nope, that's another Australopithecus. You can tell that that stone that it's carrying has been chipped to form some kind of chopper, some kind of blade or scraper. Here's Homo habilis, handyman, who now has a spear, which has been held in the fire to help harden the tip of it. Then we have, is it Neanderthal? Yeah. So here's the Neanderthal man. Now look at its spear. Very fancy spear point lashed onto the handle. They might have even used oil to, like tar, to glue it on there. But look at its small forehead. And then we have modern humans. Not only does it have a nice spear, but it has another device called a spear thrower, or we say atl-atl. And the atl-atl was used to extend the length and accuracy of the throw of the spear. So how do we know what these things look like? Well, all we can do is give it our best guess. And I want you to think about how a forensic scientist today can reconstruct an unknown person's face from their skull. And so paleoanthropologists use this same process to try to approximate what our fossil ancestors looked like. Basically, bones end up with marks on them showing where muscles were attached. So we can figure out the size and location of the muscles by looking at the marks on the skull. Then we can add skin and other tissues based on what we already know about human anatomy. So here's a series of steps. Here's the fossil skull that was found. And of course, they're not going to modify that skull. So this is a copy of the skull. And then we fill in the missing parts of bone. We fill in the deep muscles. And again, we can see their location and attachment and size by marks that were left on the bone. Then we fill in the other muscles that are on top of those deeper ones, the superficial muscles. Then we can add skin, and then we can add hair, which is pretty much of a wild guess what it might have been like. So here's some of the ones that they've reconstructed. This looks like a photo, doesn't it? But it is not. It is one of those reconstructions of another species of Homo called Homo rudolfensis. Here's one that's even more ape-like than Lucy, more ape-like than Australopithecus, called Paranthropus boisei. Here's another in the Homo tribe, Homo georgicus. This one was found in the Soviet Republic of Georgia in Eastern Europe. Australopithecus afarensis. This is the same species as Lucy. Here's a Neanderthal. A 3-year-old in the same species as Lucy. Another species of Homo, Homo ergaster. Another very ape-like one. So we're jumping around in time with these examples, right? They're not really going in any order. Ardipithecus. Another ape-like one, Paranthropus. And so all of these photos are photos basically of sculptures that we've made, but the sculptures are not just something we're making up like sci-fi. We're basing it on the actual bones that we've dug out of the ground.
Boy. Yes.
All right. So that's all I have for you today. And I want to thank you for joining me. You can turn in notes for extra credit points if you like. So I hope you have a great weekend. Remember, I'm going to be posting that final assignment that's going to give you more points than the rest of these assignments have been, because it's basically going to count as a test. So it'll give you extra credit points on your tests. All right. If you have any if you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email. Nice to see you guys, and thanks for joining me.
Later, Fairly.